Hey friend, welcome back to Planning for Cloud Cybersecurity. Now, possibly one of the most common things that I say to learners and to clients on a regular basis about cloud computing is that it is not a technology. I know. Might be a weird thing to think. I thought it was tech. We definitely talked about tech. The point is, friends, in the same way that a restaurant is not food, cloud computing service providers are not technology directly themselves. It is a service model for making technology available. And you might be thinking then, then what exactly do you consider the technology, Bart? Well, I'm awful glad you asked. Ultimately, under the hood, you're talking about virtualization. You're talking about networking. And you're talking about automation. So those are ultimately the underlying technologies that are out there. And cloud service providers are simply making them available as services that we can consume in a much more simplified interaction. In the end, though, we still recognize that we need those tools, but the administrative overhead, the complexity, indeed, the lifting that Bart has to do or that my teams have to do to use those services has been wildly reduced. In this lesson, let's spend a few minutes talking about some of the big improvements and classic models that are still available in the cloud computing world, but recognizing that we are talking about abstract, virtualized, automated resources that a service provider is making available to us. And so, kind of jumping right on in, we recognize that in the world of networking, there are really two different concepts. There is the idea of a local area network. You might have heard them call it a LAN, okay? And that is ultimately something that might live within a data center that my company owns. And heck, we might actually have multiple local area networks that live inside of that environment. The point is that a local area network is local to the data center or to the environment itself. And it's still kind of an abstract concept, especially when you recognize that in modern networks, you can make a local area network actually span hundreds to thousands of miles. And that's a much larger topic for a different time. We want to contrast LAN against the idea of a wide area network. And the one that most of us are probably familiar with is the good old internet. So the wide area network is the one that connects your data center to other resources out there on the internet. And this is why we need it to browse the internet. We need it to go and talk to cloud service providers, CSPs. And in a lot of scenarios, we might even use it to go and connect to other data centers that we own elsewhere in the world. The point is to kind of recognize that networks are comprised of hardware. But ultimately, it's what we call a logical concept on top of it. And I know that's a little bit of a crazy thing in my head. So imagine you're thinking about a neighborhood with streets. Those streets are definitely physical resources, but the house numbering system that exists on the buildings in that environment, that's not really physical. That is a logical thing that we've added on top of it. If I go and I paint over the numbers on somebody's house, it doesn't change the physical location of it, but it might affect how the mail gets delivered or how other services reach that particular building. In the same way, networks have logical layers that live on top of physical components. If you're wondering what physical components I might be referring to, I'm thinking of routers, I'm thinking of switches. In fact, I even have one that's right here. So this is like a home router that you might have in your environment. And on the back, it's got ports that connect to different environments. In fact, this one, I don't know if you can see it on there, but this one is blue. That's the internet port. That goes to the WAN. And then these are the local area network ports. Well, here I am talking about a physical piece of hardware, but these same exact principles of local versus wide area exist within our cloud service providers. And so in a previous lesson, you heard me talking about regions. Okay, what was a region again? Nice, perfect. Okay, it's a place in the world where we have services. And then inside of that, we were talking about availability zones. But we can go a little bit further and recognize that we're ultimately thinking about building networks inside of these environments. So you might go and build a virtual private cloud, which is what AWS calls the biggest piece of it. In fact, a virtual private cloud is an awful lot like this because it has the ability to connect local and wide area resources together. It also does some other interesting functionality like routing, which is a very fancy term for helping move traffic between different networks. In the end, the virtual private cloud, if you're talking Azure, this might be a virtual network or a VNet. Okay, the concepts are the same. Ultimately, the individual terminology might be a little different. And then inside of it, you would have subnets. Okay, now, although I'm using maybe some weird different terminology, in our modern enterprise networks, we have networks that contain subnets, okay? And then in those subnets, we're running servers, systems, virtual machines, maybe really fancy containers if we're familiar with that concept. But in the end, the idea behind a subnet is to create an effect known as segmentation. Okay, and the other effect is isolation. So by dividing up the network, just like the way that you might divide up people in a restaurant or in a big concert, you put them into different seating zones in different areas, it's all about identifying the purpose or some aspect of that data that drives, or of those systems that drives why they should be separated. Cloud service providers give us all of those same mechanisms. And often one of the most important segmentation and isolation is the concept of public and private. Now, I know, you look at me, I'm using my quotey fingers all over the place. But ultimately, when we say public versus private, we're talking about the visibility on the wide internet. So a subnet could be private if we make sure that only systems within our networks are able to talk to it. Typically, local area networks, like you heard me talking about earlier, they're typically private, and that means that we don't want to have regular users off the internet who aren't a part of our company interacting with the things that live inside of them. Okay, think of it as a locked door way back in the back of the building that we don't allow everybody to just walk in and access it. But on the flip side, you certainly could have a subnet that has resources that run your company's website. So if you've got a web server that's running in here and you want it to be available to people on the internet, well, you would make that subnet quote unquote public. Okay, now there's a couple of other designations that go into what makes something public, but ultimately the goal is to make it accessible to something outside of your organization's local area infrastructure. A couple other terms come along here. The idea of a gateway or an interface is exactly what I was just talking about on here. These are all interfaces, but this one to the internet becomes a gateway because it's a different type of network that you're talking to. And so in that same way, service providers give us interfaces and gateways to control how traffic moves inside of our cloud networks. Now, a lot of this comes directly from classic enterprise networks, but there are some fancy new concepts in the cloud. For example, I am not ever going to go to my cloud service provider and plug a little physical router in like this. Instead, I'm going to be choosing software components that perform that same functionality. So for example, if I head over here to AWS and we take a look at their VPC service, that is the virtual private cloud. Okay, within the VPC, I can create subnets. Oh, hey, how about we go ahead and put the share on over here? So within the virtual private cloud, over on the left, you can see I have the ability to create subnets. I have internet gateways that I can build as well. They also have NAT gateways, which is a network service. They also have VPN tunnels that are down in here. So if you get down into virtual private networks, these allow me to connect networks together over wide areas. A lot of different functionality that's available there, and it's all part of the managed offering that, in this case, AWS is offering for me. Similarly, if we take a look at the virtual networks that Azure offers us, you can see right there they offer virtual network gateways. And then within your networks, you have virtual WANs. And of course, we can then go run virtual machines inside of those environments as well. And so let's just pause for a moment here and recognize that in the world of networking, there's a whole bunch of terminology that's out there. But ultimately, we're creating segmentation and isolation for security purposes, for functionality and for performance purposes, and also just to kind of control what the functional level of those subnets. Public and private is one of the most important concepts that we typically think about, and it often has to do with whether or not we're thinking only internal access like a private subnet, or whether those resources might be available to people that access it from the internet or outside of our local organization. One of the last things to kind of recognize is that in the world of cloud computing resources, we do see that there's a bit of a duality here. In the good old days when I had a data center, okay, I actually went into that data center and I installed a physical switch that had little ports in it, just like I was showing you on there. And then I could build networks that lived out off of that. Okay, all of this lived within and was a part of these assets that I actually owned. Well, in the cloud computing world, when I think about building a virtual private cloud, you want to recognize that the virtual private cloud is completely abstract. You're not plugging anything physical in. And there's two different layers of administration there. You have the ability to move resources around inside of the subnet, but if I want to create a VPC or a subnet, we are still talking to some sort of an API in the background that allows me to build that. Now, I know I introduced this earlier in the video series. Everything in the cloud service world is driven by making API calls. So that means somewhere in the background, there is an action called create VPC. There's an action called create subnet. And so what we want to recognize here is that we're not just thinking about how traffic moves around inside of our environments. We now also in the cloud have to think about how we're going to secure the permissions for the management layers that live above it. And I know that that is a wild abstraction to make here, but in the traditional world, it would have been akin to allowing network administrators to buy and install hardware, as opposed to allowing users to plug their computers into that hardware and use those environments. Those are two entirely different kind of functional realms that still deal with some of the same resources. And so in the end, we recognize that by having resources that are built through APIs, we can get back into that integration and logging that we were talking about in the last earlier in the video series about those resources. And this now applies to our networking resources as well. And so just to kind of recap, in this lesson, we did a real kind of crazy careening deep dive, skimming and skipping along the top of the networking world. They're talking about networks being internal or external to an organization. We talked about the concept of public and private subnets. And remember, friends, this gets real technical real fast and also very vendor specific. But in the end, cloud service providers give us these mechanisms to allow us to segment and isolate parts of our network traffic in their environments. And then we can use things like gateways to extend it out to the internet or make those networks talk back to other networks that we might have running in our data centers. This is where all that LAN and WAN connectivity that I was talking about comes together. One of the last things to kind of recognize is that in the cloud, your network is a cloud resource itself. Just like we were talking about storage buckets and disks in the last lesson, we're now talking about network components that have to be built. And that means that your users, your administrators, your Stegosauruses, they need permission to interact with those resources as well. So a couple of additional levels of security and permission to kind of consider. Stick with me, friends, and in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at workloads and compute and kind of think a little bit more about how these operating systems and containers fit into these secure architectures as well. So stick with me, friends. I'll see you there.